to Day 5 of the Multicultural Women's Conference, Session 1. And thank you for joining us this week in creating a community of amazing women leaders to learn, connect, and support one another. This conference is about uplifting everyone and fostering hope during this challenging time. And wow, this has been such an amazing week. But before we begin, I want to recognize the steering committee who made this week possible. The Center for Asian Pacific American Women, OCA, the Women's Entrepreneurial Opportunity Project, Native Services at Boys and Girls Club of America, Alvanza, and VMT Consultants. I'd also like to thank our sponsor of this session who is with us this evening, AARP. The theme of this session is to spotlight on multicultural women, celebration of empowerment in her story. And the name of this session is our Voices, Civic, and Community Engagement. Before we begin our panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Daphne Kwok, our keynote to help frame our panel discussion. Daphne is the Vice President of the Multicultural Leadership for the Asian American and Pacific Islander Audience Strategy at AARP. Her work empowers Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to choose how they live as they age. She brings to AARP her experience as a leader of leaders through her community service in promoting and empowering the AAPI community. Please give a warm welcome to Daphne Kwok.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you to everybody. I really commend all of you who have joined us today. What a tremendous week this has been. And I think what's especially important is that the organizers of the conference have truly brought all of us together. And I think together we have a tremendous strength as women and as women of color in particular. So AARP is so honored to be able to be part of this week and today especially. And I wanted to just share a few thoughts with you and to sort of put everything into a framework for the esteemed colleagues on this panel who will be speaking later as well. So I just want to say kudos again to everyone that's been involved in putting this week's programming together. And I think one of the silver linings really behind this past year of the pandemic is that really all of us can engage now, right? Whoever has access to the internet, that we hopefully are reaching a much, much wider audience. And I know that the numbers certainly show it in the participation this week. I hope that as we close out this week, as we reflect on what we have learned to advance our own professional careers, as well as to advance our own personal well-being, let's also reflect on what is most important to all of us today. Today is March 5th, 2021. In just 6 days, it will be March 11th, when this nation really has set the anniversary, a 1-year anniversary of when COVID has hit this nation. And when really our nation went into a lockdown throughout the country. And so I know that for especially the Asian American Pacific Islander community, actually for us it's been even longer because we know that the impact of COVID hit our community more than a month, really 2 months earlier. I know this because actually in February 8th of 2020, I was looking at my calendar, I was out in San Francisco as AARP participated in the San Francisco Lunar New Year Parade, a huge, huge event. And there are just hundreds of thousands of people lining the street every year. But already last year, February 8th, 2020, there was a marked decrease in people coming out already in fear of the pandemic. So all of our communities have been impacted. You might be thinking, where am I going with this line of thought? And I'm really gearing it towards one of gratitude. I know this year has been horrific in so many ways for so many people. But for me, I feel a great sense of gratitude that I've been very, very fortunate. And I know that I'm very fortunate in my situation. But so I hopefully in this past year that in the role that I've played at AARP, that I've been able to give back, contribute back to our communities during this time of COVID, especially by being able to get critical information out into community. I think part of today's session is really about civic participation, civic engagement, and I think that's just so important as we all be active participants in our community. And so for me, my civic engagement, especially over this last year, was really helping our communities be able to tackle, stay safe from the COVID pandemic. And so for me, I'm part of the multicultural leadership team at AARP. So I work and my teammates work in African American and Hispanic, the LGBTQ community, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native communities. And so our task really, as you may know, AARP, we're really working and for people age 50 plus and their families. And so therefore, our elders who may be in that age group. I think for all of our communities represented here at this conference, our elders are so revered. They are held in such high regard. They truly have traveled tremendous travails in their lifetimes and have made tremendous sacrifices to all of us so that we can hopefully be in a good place for ourselves individually and as a community. And so I think that this year in particular, the COVID year, the work that we did and for all of us to be able to help protect our elders was so key and critical. Especially right now, as we know, where our elders are extremely vulnerable, that especially the attacks against our elders, and especially in the AAPI community, as many of you have been reading in the press, the COVID has had, a triple whammy against our communities, right? Causing social isolation, not only because of the lockdown, but because of language isolation, cultural isolation. And so for our elders of color, it's been extremely difficult. I think one of the things that for us as a community, hopefully we have all been involved in reaching out to our elders to be able to care for them, to be able to help them with food, making sure there's not food insecurity in the communities, making sure that they have information of how to be vaccinated, and hopefully especially the younger generation, are able to help and assist our elders as well too. One of the stats that I learned when I first came to AARP is about loneliness, and which right now, as we all know, for all our communities, is the numbers are going to be so sky high in the number of people socially isolated, but also lonely. And loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes per day. You can imagine what the physical impact, the mental health impact, and the emotional impact of loneliness is causing on our elders today. So one of the things that I just wanted to say is that it's really critical that all of us, as part of our civic engagement, that we don't forget about our elders. They are very proud people. They often don't want assistance. They want to remain independent, but we have to be hyper vigilant in taking care of them, making sure that they're okay. So I hope that as we talk about civic engagement, that we really remember this cohort, this group of individuals that have meant so much to our communities. Actually, right before coming on to this session, I was reading through my Facebook feed, and there was one article that was posted talking about how in this past year, we have lost so many people from the older generation, many that were really our civil rights leaders, and how it's now so key and important that we really document their histories, for those that have passed, to document them, to let people know about their contributions. More importantly, for those that are still with us today, how important it is to document their contributions. Because as we know, American history has not been that inclusive of our communities. And so therefore it's incumbent on us to make sure that our American history is also a complete history representing all our communities. And that's all part of being involved ourselves as well as for the younger generation. And I just want to close that there's so much for all of us to do as we continue to move forward, as we continue to unite this country together. And so now more than ever, we need to be selfless as we take care of ourselves, as we take care of our families, our loved ones, our elders, and most importantly, each other. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Daphne, for your inspirational remarks, but really powerful remarks. And really, thank you for your leadership too. So I also want to introduce our panelists, and I would love for them to share more about themselves. So without further ado, please welcome to the panel. We'll start with the CFO of East Bay Community Foundation, Valerie Redforce.
Thank you, Carla. I'm so delighted to be here. And I just love Carla. She has been a friend of mine for many, many years. And it's funny, she used to say that I was her mentor. I think she's more my mentor now. So I would do anything for her. And I'm just continuing with Daphne's theme of gratitude. I'm very thankful to be here. So Carla asked each of us to tell a little about ourselves. And I have to say that when you look at my resume, you might get confused because I do all kinds of crazy things. But the intersection is, I'm a strong woman of faith, and I believe that everything I've done has been part of God's plan. And I'm happy when I'm working together and making a difference, hopefully, in the world. I'm a proud mother and wife. I have 3 amazing children, and I've been with my husband over 40 years. So my family always brings a smile to my face as well. I spent most of my career as an entrepreneur. I started the first Native American-owned investment bank on Wall Street, simultaneously launched the first, what we think the first female film production company in Hollywood. And so, 2 crazy industries, very challenging, but I spent many, many years making films and structuring capital for tribal nations to build their economic development. More recently, I've segued into teaching. I teach at Stanford University. I teach entrepreneurialism with a racial equity and social impact lens. And as Carla mentioned, I'm the full-time Chief Financial Officer for the East Bay Community Foundation. And that is, we manage about $1 billion worth of money that is intended to do good in the world. So making grants in and around the Oakland area, which is very multicultural, but also with our investments. And my real goal in doing that is to really shift capital. And I believe right now, as we focus on racial equity and gender equity in the world, we have to shift capital in order to see economic justice that goes right alongside that with all of the issues that we're facing. Some of the ones Daphne mentioned, whether it's climate or health, we cannot make the improvements we want to see happen without the shifting of capital. And so a lot of my work is trying to see that shift of capital to women, women-owned businesses and women-led funds. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Carla, just thank you for having me here. And I'm so honored to be with this esteemed group of women.
Well, thank you, Valerie. I am so honored to have you here, like I said, as my mentor, my friend, and you are such an inspiring woman leader. So thank you for joining us today. And next, I want to welcome to our panel, Kumo Miley. She's an educator, performer, consultant for Hawaiian cultural arts, and co-founder of an online school of Hawaiian knowledge. So please welcome Kumo Miley.
Belina me ke aloha ia kākoa pau o wau o kumu maile na ehu mai ka mokupuni o Molokaʻi, Hawaii. My name is Tanya Mailelani na ehu, and I am a Boricua. My mother is of Boricua descent, which is a Taino, African, and Spanish. My father being Portuguese, Hawaiian, and Chinese. I was born and raised in Hawaii. It's the only home I've ever known. I am a descendant of immigrants to Hawaii during the 1800s that came to work as plantation workers, as well as my Hawaiian ancestors who I can trace myself back to and link me to this Aina, this land itself. So I have only really identified with this place as home, and so rightfully so, it's the culture that raised me and nurtured me. I went to a school for Native Hawaiian children, and although it was a school for Native Hawaiian children, it didn't really foster that type of learning that I yearned for as far as my cultural identity. So I majored in Hawaiian studies at University of Hawaii Manoa and decided to be an educator. I've been an educator for the Hawaiian community in Hawaiian language immersion and servicing Native Hawaiian children throughout Hawaii for the last 20 years. I also have, I pulled away from the Department of Education and decided to create my own school, which is Kahale Hoaka, an online school of Hawaiian learning. And it is owned by two women from Hawaii, and for the purpose of bringing our language and our stories into the homes of Hawaii in order to build a better sense of place, self-stewardship to our land. As many of you know, Hawaii is very commercialized. And so my goal is to bring back the respect that our land deserves by bringing back our cultural practices into the homes and making it the everyday norm. So besides that, I'm also the co-chair for Huio Kuapa, which is a nonprofit for that works towards restoring ancient Hawaiian fish ponds, some of them more than 800 years old, on our islands, as well as sharing with others how to go through that process on other islands of Hawaii. Our island alone has over 58 ancient Hawaiian fish ponds that are slowly being restored. So I align all of my teachings with language, with the culture, as well as the practices and relationships that we have with our land and our sea, and being able to provide and feed ourselves. We call it aloha aina, this love for the land, as if it is a family member. And so that's the foundation of everything I teach. And on top of that, there's one more project that I have worked on, which is a art project to bring forth the stories of our people. So that's me. Aloha.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that well, first of all, I want to thank you for helping to keep traditions alive. To me, that's so important. And I could hear the passion in your voice when you talked about that. So just Willie Wani, thank you for keeping traditions alive. So
Thank you.
Absolutely. So our next guest I'd love to introduce is Ramona Lee Akiyama, the City of Philadelphia's Deputy Director of the Office of Immigrant Affairs. So please welcome Ramona.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you to all of the hosts and sponsors who have put together this conference this entire week. I'm just really honored to be here on this panel with my esteemed colleagues and to hear all of their stories. And thank you so much, Daphne, for your inspiring remarks. I think it definitely resonated with me and my background and what I'm going to be sharing tonight. So my name is Ramona Lee Akiyama, as Carla said, and I currently, in my professional role, I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Immigrant Affairs for the City of Philadelphia. And our office's charge and responsibility is to ensure the meaningful inclusion of immigrants and refugees in civic, economic, and cultural life of the City of Philadelphia. So this involves recommending policies and programs to ensure overall well-being of our immigrant and refugee populations in our city, which number approximately 15% of the overall population. Philadelphia population is about 1.5 million people. I am from Philadelphia and super proud to be able to serve the city in this capacity as a public servant. I am trained as a social worker. I'm also the daughter of an immigrant, and these two really important pieces of my background play so much into my perspective and my approach to both work and to life. Prior to this role of coming onto the city's leadership team, I had 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. I've worked in various kinds of nonprofit organizations, including grassroots community-based organizations, national advocacy organizations, grant-making organizations, and most recently, international organizations. I took this role with the city almost exactly 1 year ago. I started the week before the COVID shutdown happened. That Friday of my first week, they handed me a laptop and said, I think you're going to be needing this. And so I've been working remotely this entire time. My personal background and the communities that I identify with, I am mixed race, Asian American. My father was a political refugee from China, and my mom is of Eastern European descent. She's of German and Hungarian descent. And I am a proud mom to a 10-year-old child who is of Japanese, Native Hawaiian, Chinese, and European descent. So we are one big mixed family and truly a Pan-Asian family. I'm super honored to be here tonight and really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. And it really leads into her story. You know, everybody that spoke so far has talked about their background, and I think it really leads into the panel discussion that we'll have tonight. So I am going to ask all the panelists to join me. Let's stay on camera and let's start some discussions. So, you know, as I shared, like when I think of history and I think of, you know, what our ancestors endured for us to be here today, when I think of those that have paved the way for us to be in leadership roles, and I think of her story, you know, I want to start with the question of who has inspired you, paved the way, what were their values that you learned from that person? So I know that's a big question, but I'm going to start with Val first, if that's okay.
Absolutely. And I think our wonderful colleague Jackie has the timer, because on this one, she's going to have to really nudge me. As you know, Carla, as a filmmaker, one of my favorite films that I was so honored to be given the role of directing and producing was about Wilma Mankiller, one of our greatest leaders in Indian country of all time. And Carla traveled to Washington, D.C. to see the film when we premiered it on the Hill. And I learned a lot from studying Wilma's life. Of course, I knew who she was before I made the film. And we started the process in 2012 and released it in 2018. And it took a long time because she had a very long and accomplished life, including working with Gloria Steinem on women's rights, developing economic development in the Cherokee Nation that's really laid the path for, it's my heritage as well, but the Cherokee Nation is one of the largest and most successful tribes from an economic development and diversification standpoint. But what I learned from her that I think is really important for all women was to understand what servant leadership means. She called herself a servant leader, and she was a liberal Democrat, but worked with conservative Republicans. She didn't put labels on people, men, women, Indian, non-Indian. It didn't matter to her because she was there to serve her constituents first and foremost. And she also believed that we need to listen to those impacted the most instead of making decisions for them if we're in leadership. So she would roll up her sleeves, get into the community and say, how can I help you? What do you want? Instead of trying to bring solutions in, which I think is important in all of our communities when we need to really support the community base and the idea of community. And then finally, what I learned from her that I think is such an important lesson right now, if you think about the divided country we live in, how news can be very divisive, and we listen to sort of commentary and bias with what we agree on. But basically, Wilma took a 360-degree view from every single viewpoint, even people that disagreed with her. When she launched gaming, she really had a tough time, but she listened to the opposition and then incorporated their opinions into the solutions, even if they still disagreed. And I think we can learn from Wilma today about coming together, listening to views around us, even if we don't agree with them, no more divisiveness, and let's move forward in solutions, holding hands together across the aisle, across communities. That's why I love that this is a multicultural conference. And again, I'm just delighted to be here and hold up Wilma Mankiller as one of our real legendary role models.
Thank you, Valerie. And I still remember that day going to DC and watching that documentary. I left feeling like I could accomplish anything. She was such an inspiring leader. And somebody earlier this week said something that resonated, and I wish I could remember the exact thing, but sometimes decisions are made about us without us. And what I loved is that she brought them forth, brought them in, instead of saying this is the solution, and they were part of it. So she is very inspiring. Thank you for sharing. All right, so I'm going to ask the same question to Kumo Miley.
I have to give credit to my mom, first of all. She truly is a driving force for who I am. Helala no wau no ku'ukumu. I am a branch of my beloved trees. Jeez. I just lost my mother recently during the time of COVID, and it's made me stronger than I've ever been. And I realize it's because mom made me go to these cultural experiences. She made me go to hula. Oh, I didn't like it. It took up all my weekends since the age of 4. She sent me to a school for Native Hawaiian children because her herself, as a strong Borenkwa woman, saw the value in culture. And so I was very brought up around the Borenkwa culture, and she wanted to offer that balance. She loved the Hawaiian culture so much, and being that my father, is Hawaiian, she thought it was only fitting. So she pushed me into these experiences that would give me a stronger sense of identity. I eventually became a kumu myself, and give a lot of credit back, not just to my mother, but the teachers that she brought me to, being other Hawaiian practitioners, the best storytellers in Hawaii, the best professors, Hawaiian professors in Hawaii. It was because my mother pushed me into those areas and into those experiences. So all the credit goes to Mama.
Thank you for sharing. And I can see now where that passion is coming from that I felt earlier. I could hear when you talked about your culture and your traditions, I could feel that power. And that's, your mom was such an inspiration. I have to share, I'm a daddy's girl. So yeah, and he's passed so many traditions on to me. And so thank you for sharing something so personal and someone that's inspired you.
Thank you.
All right, Ramona.
Carla, I too am a daddy's girl, and Leilani talked about her mom, and so I'm going to talk about my dad. And I talked about my career and the choices that I made and how much it was influenced by my family's experience. And so as I think about my father, unfortunately, we lost him to COVID as well, just about 2.5 months ago. My father was a pioneering artist. He was a pioneering Asian immigrant artist. His name was Chen Li. And he came to the United States about 60 years ago. He was a political refugee from China who left the country at a time of major political upheaval. He grew up during a time when the country was being occupied by the Japanese. They grew up in extreme poverty, political dis-ease, and violence, essentially. My father was still able to build his early career as a primary school principal. And then at the time when the communists came to China and were starting to build political power, he spoke out against them. And one night in an emergency situation, he had to leave. He had to leave the country. His family had found out that they were coming after him, and his brother took him down to the water, and essentially he swam out. He swam out with nothing on him except an inner tube. So he swam out towards Hong Kong, and a boat eventually picked him up and took him to Hong Kong, where he was in the company of many other refugees also fleeing the same kind of situation in China. So my father stayed in Hong Kong for a bit of time before he was able to come to the United States as a refugee. And that's when he decided to take this chance at a new life, came to this country, recreated himself, built a whole new life for himself without any family here, and eventually became a successful and well-respected artist and professor who taught at Moore College of Art and Design here in Philadelphia for over 20 years. And so what I learned from him was a spirit of resiliency. It's of fortitude. It's of courage. And he always used to say that I lived through the war, I lived through this, I lived through this, being able to come to the United States and to struggle in all of these different ways. And that's the same strength that I learned from. And when he passed away, he passed that energy to me.
Thank you for sharing. You know, you said a word that as I was listening to you share the story about your dad, and you right at the very end, and this word came to my mind before you even said it, but resiliency. And what he was able to do was provide a place for you to thrive. And look where you are today. And I can see why you're a daddy's girl, knowing everything that he endured for you to thrive today. So thank you for sharing such a personal story. All right, I'm going to pivot a little bit and move on to the next question. And you kind of started to get into this space too, but if you could define some of the barriers that you went through and how you were able to overcome them. So I'm going to mix it up and start with Kumo Miley, if that's okay.
Yes. Well, I mentioned that I went to a school for Native Hawaiian children, and it was a really safe space. And then I stepped outside of that space and I realized that I was being, I guess, a lot of the social norms and acceptances of what a Kanaka Maoli or a Hawaiian looks like didn't fit me. And so I started to come into a lot of barriers where people were saying, oh, you're not Native Hawaiian, you're not Polynesian. And, you know, to a young woman, that can really get into your head. And so there was this constant inner barrier that society created, that I created within myself. So that was the first, one of the many barriers. Another barrier was just society in general and how they valued the Hawaiian culture, and deciding that I was going to major in Hawaiian studies, be a teacher in that field. I heard there were a lot of naysayers. What are you going to do with that? You know, how are you going to make a living teaching Hawaiian stuff? You know, I grew up in the era where everything was geared toward tourism. I was being fed the idea that I needed to learn Japanese. My sister learned Japanese, you know, because that was a thing to do to be successful. And so there was a lot of these barriers coming from all different directions. I wanted to be Hawaiian, but I didn't look the part, or I wanted to be Hawaiian, but it wasn't successful to be Hawaiian. So there are many different barriers that were being pushed on me. And what I realized in the end was that I come from greatness. You know, I realized, whoa, like our people were almost completely wiped out, like from my Borinqua side and my Hawaiian side. I mean, almost completely wiped out. And realizing that I am a survivor of that gave me more power than I ever thought I had. And knowing that I had millions of them standing behind me everywhere I went, the seen and the unseen. And so that really got me past it. And it still powers me till today.
I love that story. I'll share something with you before I turn it over to Ramona, who can share some of her barriers and how she has overcome them. You know, both my husband and I are from the same tribe, look very Native. And my daughter, her hair is changing, becoming dark now, but she was born with blonde hair. And yes, and a lot of people would ask her, and I understand, yes, that's difficult. All right, Ramona.
So we're here at a conference for multicultural women, and I think I want to be straight in my response around this, that we live in a racist society, you know, where white supremacy really takes a toll. As an example of how this impacts our laws, my parents were married in 1973. So if we know our history, Loving v. Virginia was the case that allowed for couples of different races to marry legally throughout the United States, because prior to that, it was not legal. And even though my parents were together in 1973 in the state of Pennsylvania, And I actually just found this out recently. My parents would have been married for almost 48 years. My mom told me that they were not able to get married in Pennsylvania because the pastor from the church where my grandparents had attended would not marry them. And so they eloped. They went out to the Southwest to New Mexico and actually got married in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so I raise all this just to say that, the history of mixed race in America, and for me as an Asian American mixed race woman, there's this a sense of shame that had carried on, and whether it was under the surface, it was still there. And I think that was a barrier that, to be honest, the fact that we still live in this country, you don't have to do anything but turn on the news to see what our society is like and how challenging it can be for communities of color. And then I think the internalized racism that has come with this, with being mixed race has also been a barrier. There's the narrative that many mixed race people have felt that we are half, right? Instead of full. When you describe somebody who is half, you say, oh, they're half, etc., half, whatever. And so one way that throughout my years I've been able to overcome that is to really understand and focus on that, no, I am whole and complete. I'm not half of anything. I'm a whole person that happens to have more than one cultural background. I'm blessed to have 2 cultural backgrounds.
Thank you for keeping it real and in feeling that this is a safe place to share, and in saying it, calling it, and putting a name to it. So my instincts is telling me is that Val is probably going to share some similar thoughts and challenges that she was able to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Ramona. I just want to build on that because my work right now, every day, we're focused on dismantling white supremacy, racial and gender inequity. But the one statement we really stand firm on is attack the systems and the systemic bias, not the people. So we still embrace people of all color, including white males, but it's really about how can we all work together to dismantle the inequities. And for me, when I talk about my challenges and barriers, mine have been more gender biased. So I decided to start businesses in Hollywood and Wall Street, 2 male-dominated industries where if I wanted to, be a secretary, or even in Hollywood, if I just wanted to be an actress, I was welcome. But when I started to actually control companies and control assets and money, that's when I was marginalized and dismissed. It wasn't accepted. And I really had to learn a lot of lessons about myself in order to become the business leader that I wanted to be. And now I work every day with women who want to become business leaders and own companies. And that's what I really enjoy, is encouraging and supporting other women. And hopefully some of my pain that I experienced can be helpful. And so for everyone, how I really address these barriers was first and foremost, we're nurturers as women, and often we want to be liked, we want everyone to be happy. And I had to learn that when you're in business and you have to make tough decisions, it's not about being liked or popular. You have to make the decisions that are right for your team, for your company, and not capitulate to just wanting to make everyone happy. And what's also kind of related, I realized that what other people think does not define me. I'm defined by God, my creator, my family, not by people who might be very mean-spirited. And you just have to really figure out what defines you in a good way. And for me, that was my relationship with God and family. And then, I had to work with a lot of males. And I really was confused sometimes with how forceful they were and how unfair they treated me. And my husband's a white male who obviously loves and supports me. So getting his perspective was really helpful. I think always having an ally who is a white male can be very, very helpful. Someone who supports you and can give you advice, because I don't think like a man and my husband does. And so he could give me great advice. And then finally, I think almost the most important piece of advice is having older women mentors. that have gone before you. And I have one in finance, I have one in film, and I just can't say how much the ability to reach out. It's like that show, you have a lifeline, call a friend, you know, someone there to talk to has, they've talked me off a ledge many, many times. So our community right here that we have is amazing. And I would say take advantage of it.
She failed to mention that her husband was an NFL football player. So if anybody messed with Valerie, he's her big protector. So I just had to share that. But hearing these stories from Ramona calling it real, like really naming it, and Miley sharing her experience growing up, and just hearing this, what is our civic and community engagement, and what is our personal role that we're going to play going forth for the next generation? So I'm going to start with Kumu Miley. Whoops, she's on mute.
My role in the community. Well, as an educator, I saw working very closely with the youth, preschool age to high school. I saw a need for venues and workshops and projects that nurtured creative energy. Our children on Molokai, especially, our schools are about 75% Native Hawaiian on this island. We are the most rural island in Hawaii. And with that, as we all know, as women, multicultural women, culture can offer a lot of really creative energy. And so these children had this energy that wasn't being fostered. And I said, oh, something has to be done. And especially for my three keiki, I have three children, and I saw that they had an interest in the arts and the culture. And so I started to just create programs on my own as a mom, like no funding. I started seeking out funding. I didn't have any nonprofit. I found nonprofits to sponsor me, and I started projects that were based on culture and the arts, whether it be performance, whether it be slam poetry, whether it be hip hop, whether it be painting. We offer all of those things, and it just snowballed, and it became something bigger than I thought it would ever be. And it's because it was something that was needed for so long in our small community. And to see these children come to light and really be themselves and be able to tell their stories through these different contemporary mediums, traditional stories, that they grew up with, and then apply it to these contemporary mediums. It's just been really incredible to watch them blossom over time and step into themselves. So that is what my main mission is to restore their voice and give them a strong sense of identity.
And why I think it took off, like you didn't expect it, is there's so much people, passion, purpose in you. Like you are just so passionate about keeping the culture alive. And so when you said you didn't realize that it would be as big as it is, I'm not surprised. All right. Yes. Ramona, same question.
So I talked a little bit about the work that I get to do on a daily basis through city government of representing immigrant and refugees in the city and ensuring equal access and meaningful inclusion. But what I wanted to spend this time talking about is actually a passion project that I've launched since my father has passed away. I am working on, I'm on a journey to preserve his legacy as an artist, as an Asian immigrant artist. And this has involved documenting his story, documenting his art, documenting the challenges that he faced as an immigrant artist, as an Asian American artist, and how I want to change that narrative now for him. And so it's interesting is I've been walking through his path now, 50 years later. And what I think makes this really different is that I'm telling the story through my lens. Shortly after my father passed away, I really got this feeling that I was supposed to be open in this process with my grief. I think grief is something that is not publicly discussed. It's not publicly expressed. It's something that many of us just keep deep inside of us. And that was something that for me, at the time my father's passing, I felt being called again to be open with it. And perhaps it was the fact that, I had counted, there were about 13 of my friends who had lost a parent within a very short period of time. I believe it was from Thanksgiving until the start of the new year in 2021. And I just kept watching over and over again as my friends were losing their parents. And I felt that there has to be some way that I can contribute to this conversation and to helping people grieve together. And so I started sharing my father's story. I started sharing my memories, started sharing his art. And then I decided, with great advice from those who are in the art world who are helping me with this project, that I should actually turn this into the story, is my documentation of the journey. And so I would love everyone here to help follow the story. I'll drop into the chat later on what the Instagram handle is, but we've established a blog, a website, and an Instagram page so that we can begin sharing it out. And I think especially now at this time of extreme levels of anti-Asian bias and sentiment, it's not lost on me that I'm starting this project right now, because I really hope to be able to share what he was able to contribute and what other Asian Americans contribute to society, and to lift up what some of the challenges have been and continue to be today.
I love sharing our stories, and how when we share our stories, it helps us heal. And, even giving the time to grieve properly is so important. So I can't wait to see the link you're going to drop. We do have a question, but before we move to the question, I'm going to ask Valerie to share what is her civic and community engagement, and then we'll go to the question.
Great, thank you. I love this question because as we mentioned in my introduction, I'm the CFO for the East Bay Community Foundation, which is focused on community. And I believe community can be defined by geography or many other lived experiences, including like our Native community. I also am part of a very global discussion around how we address racial and gender inequity. And a lot of us believe it will start with communities, and then we can find those solutions in communities and replicate. But when we talk about community, we touched on this a little bit before, but I'm going to go a little deeper. Power dynamics are so very important when we want to move away from colonialism and all of the sort of negative systemic bias that we experience. And so I want to give you a quick illustration. I want you to think about a party, a celebratory party. And this party is being controlled by the person who owns the estate on which the party will take place. They're also controlling the music that's being played, the food that's being served, and the invitation list. So we all know what exclusion means. That means you're not invited to the party. But let's think about words that are being used right now actually inaccurately. Inclusion simply means that entity in control is saying you can come to my party. Tolerance is simply saying, I don't agree with you. I don't even like how you act, but I'm going to let you sit over here in this corner of my party. Empowerment really, at the end of the day, means I have all the power. I'm controlling the party, but you know what? I'm going to give you a little bit of the power, and you're going to get to pick some of the food. None of that are the power dynamics that we need to see in community. Instead, we want to move, and this is a model that John Powell developed at University of California, Berkeley. It's called belonging. And this is a model where if you're having a party, everyone who's involved is co-authoring, co-creating, coming together to decide as a community what is best for those people impacted, not a power dynamic of someone else, some external party, because they have money or because the color of their skin or because the Constitution originally was interpreted in a certain way. None of that should apply when you're in community. It should be all about belonging together. And I truly believe that when we reach those models and we can replicate them from community globally, we will actually be able to see some real solutions. And that belonging includes white people, people of color, women, people with lived experiences, people with all lived experiences from all different backgrounds. And that's what really then we see the solutions happening.
Thank you, Valerie, for sharing, because, you know, where I work for a youth serving organization, I think we tell our youth or our youth development professionals that work with children to create an environment that creates that sense of a belonging, and going back to their sense of identity. So there's a sense of self-pride, but sometimes as we move into adults and not everyone practices or remembers the importance of creating that sense of belonging. So I think that's powerful, a word just saying belonging and how we can start changing. Oh, we do have a question in the chat box, and anyone feel free to answer it. So the question is, how do you respond to white people who insist on being a part of the sacred spaces for people of color? Would anybody like to take that on?
I'll give it a shot. Being that I have an online school, it's open. You know, I don't go through the process of whether you're Indigenous or not, or proving ancestry. It's open for all. And it's, I just had this question the other day. Somebody said, oh, same, in different words, the same question. And I said, I truly think it's about intention. It's different when sacred spaces, when it becomes maybe spiritual or ceremonial. There's something that I like to refer to as the pico, or the pico circle. The pico is your navel, where life came from your mother. So there's a circle in the middle, and this is where the Indigenous people lie, the people who are the decision makers, the people who are the influencers. And then we have circles that come farther out in the community. And the farther you are in the community, you're still in the community, but you might not have as much decision-making power. You might not be the one, you know, that has the Indigenous lineage, you know, to be in that center. But in Hawaii, it's hard because we all come from different races. We're all mixed. There's no such thing as like a pure Hawaiian anymore. I think there's maybe a handful of them left. So we have created space for other races. And in Hawaii, especially because we're so colonized, especially by the tourism industry, imposing their ideals of what Hawaii is, I think I've opened my space to all that are willing to learn. That's where I am right now. That's where a lot of our people are, because our land is in dire need of more aloha and more love. We import 90% of our food here, you know, so if we can create a better relationship with our land here in Hawaii by educating people more about our language holds the key to a lot of understandings as far in our language, our stories, our traditions, then I welcome it. I also will go back to the circle thing. They have a place. So if they are not of the tribe or the Indigenous, you know, ancestry, then they have another place, but they still can hold a place or space within that. So that's where I come from as far as my online school. And I've taught all races, all ages. And it's really about intention. It's really about intention.
Thank you for your willingness to take on the question in the chat box. Would anybody want to add to it before I move to the next question? We're good? Okay. All right. So this question is, what is your outlook for the future of multicultural women? And I'm going to start with Val.
So I'm going to use another illustration because I like illustrations, but the fact is 70% of our global population are people of color that identify as being a person of color, and over 51% are women. And so I don't use the word minority ever because we're actually now a majority globally. And yet 97% of our monetary assets are managed by white males. So we know that something's off in the systemic bias of our management of our resources. So I'm going to use an analogy because I had to finance gaming for so many years with our tribes. I want you to think of a roulette wheel. And there's a ball that lands on either a black or a red square. And the mathematical probability is it will happen on red 50% of the time and on black 50% of the time. If it was ever off, the managers would come screaming onto the floor. They would get the table off the floor because it would be broken and there would be an issue. So the fact that nothing has been done over the years to right this wrong of 97% of our assets being controlled by one group is what I'm focusing on, because as we shift our capital to women and people of color, we find that companies run by women are actually making more money, and companies that have a majority of women on their boards are making more money. And it's not just about money, it's about decisions that affect things like climate and healthcare. We just saw some horrible things happen in Texas here with the storms, and the utilities weren't able to handle that. They didn't have a very diverse board. And I'm suggesting that as we get more women on boards, as we get more women in control of companies, we will start to see an improvement as we shift our assets towards more of a community-based perspective. And so my goal is to help in that very challenging sector of finance and move and shift capital so that we know that women are actually in positions of leadership and they're being supported and elevated and their stories being heard, and that will have a ripple effect to our future generations.
I love that. Future generations. Love it. So, same question, Ramona. What is your outlook for future of multicultural women?
Great. This is a great question. And thank you, Val, for your passionate response. And you're talking about decision makers and leaders. And when I first heard this question or saw this question, my immediate thought was to our Vice President, Kamala Harris. And I know that when she was sworn in, there were many people who cried and were so happy. And I was one of those people who felt myself just overwhelmed with emotion. And I think it was not just because she was a woman, not just because she was a woman of color, but because she was a mixed race woman of color. And I think that just speaks wonders to where we are as a country and where we can go. And I felt personally seen and heard and included. And when she said, "I'm speaking," I think that just had a totally different meaning. And it was just incredibly powerful. So I actually found a poem that I wanted to read that just really deeply resonated with me and reflects how I'm feeling about this question. Rupi Kaur is an Indian Canadian young woman poet who just published I believe her third book called Home. So I'm going to read this poem called Stronger Together. Women have been starved of space for so long that when one of us finally makes it into the arena, we're made to feel there isn't enough room for all of us. That if we're not careful, another woman might come along and take our spot. But space doesn't work like that. Look at all the men in the arena, getting stronger as their numbers multiply. More women in the arena means more room for all of us to rise.
We all want to clap. Give her some shine. We do shine. I love that. I almost feel like that needs to be dropped in the chat box for all of us to remember. I love that. All right, so same question, Kumo Miley.
There's so much ahead. I see women more than ever supporting each other. Just like this space that we're sharing today, to be support and encourage each other to seek out our dreams. I see women redefining what success means by outside of the conforms of Western society, what we've been fed to think of what success means. I see women seeking more, we call it self-care, whatever you want to call it, but just being happy within themselves. I also see that our women are seeking their callings, which is a really beautiful thing to watch. And I think it's a generational thing. You know, when you think back to the 60s and the 70s and the times of change. And in Hawaii during the late 70s, we call it the Hawaiian Renaissance. It was when we had a dozen native speakers. And then we decided, hey, we want to start sailing across the Pacific again. We want to start navigating with the stars again. We want to bring immersion schools back again. And so there's this really cool saying that a friend shared with me, and he said, one generation's knowledge is the next generation's wisdom, and it becomes the next generation's being. So if you think back to the 60s, in the 60s and 70s to now, we've watched 3 generations pass. And so I can see it in my children. I can see women just like us raising the next generation of strongly rooted young individuals that know exactly who they are and where they're going because of ancient practices and wisdoms that have never steered us wrong. Considering all the influences of modern times, our answers are already there. And I see more and more women seeking those answers in spaces. I also love that I'm seeing more the embrace of gender roles and identity within our people, and knowing that there are places, there always have been places for every gender, and we were accepted, and we had a kuleana and a role, and it was valued. And I love that that's being, that is who we are, and we're stepping into our being. I also want to, acknowledge all the women that are putting in the effort to building and raising resilient women. And also the women who are raising resilient sons and teaching them how to be good sons, how to be good men, and how to honor a woman. So I'm seeing all these beautiful changes, and I just wanted to encourage all of the beautiful wahine, your women out there, and remind you that we are a catalyst for change. We are the creators. We are the ones that ignite the change. And to activate yourself and be activists, whether it be raising awareness, offering aid, or creating action.
I love it. And when I listen to all 3 of you talk, the last question that we have, and to sum up like everything I'm hearing. So as we redefine our space, pave the way for future generations to thrive, what do we have to do? So Ramona?
I like to start with the idea of radical self-acceptance and self-compassion. And I really learned this as a parent, as a mother. I learned that in order for me to be compassionate to the next generation, to my child, to my family, it really meant that I had to do the work on myself and find compassion for myself. So I start with that. And also thinking about that next generation. The other philosophy that I have really leaned into is listening to that generation, because children will tell us who they are, and we just need to listen to them. We cannot project onto them. We cannot apply what we want them to do or who we want them to be, because there will be a battle. And so really listening and helping them find ways to flourish. And, lastly, I'll close with just the mantra or the belief that has really guided my life, my family, is in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from.
I love it. And children are so honest. All right, Valerie, what do we have to do?
Well, I think we have a lot of challenges that we're addressing head on right now, which are important. However, we can't ever forget that most of our lives are built on relationships. And we need to continue with this idea of belonging and how we can all co-create and come together. I think self-care is a very, very important one. We have a relationship with ourselves that many women who are busy kind of forget. And so I would encourage that. But then the motto that I had lived by is really putting every day at the top of my list 2 things that I need to think about in everything I do, whether I'm grocery shopping or doing an asset allocation on billions of dollars of capital. And that is, I need to love God and love others. And if I do those 2 things, then I'm typically hitting the right marks on how I treat people and I can still be radical in my ideas and innovative, and I want to see things shift dramatically. But if I love God and love others, then I'm always doing it with a heart that is in the right place, with the right intention. And so I just would like to leave that with everyone to think about as they go about making a big difference in the world.
Beautiful. All right, Kumo, Miley, what do we need to do?
What do we need to do? I think it's just really important for us to step outside of what we think we've been fed all these years growing up of what we need to do. You know, it's not supposed to look like what we've been taught in school. It's really not. And once you start pushing yourself as an individual, I speak from personal experience, into uncomfortable spaces, you will truly grow as a woman. I know I was very influenced, like I mentioned earlier, by outside words that were fed to me over years and years of how I defined myself. And once I let go of all of that, and you know, it really wasn't until I was like in my late 30s that I realized, like, you know what, none of that even matters. Like, I need to worry about myself, how Valerie said. We need to just start concentrating on ourselves, because there's no way we can exude all of this beautiful mana and power from within ourselves or a higher source if we haven't fed ourselves. And so a lot of feeding ourselves comes from things that are very uncomfortable. You know, challenging yourself, stepping into places that you've never stepped into before, saying, oh man, this is so scary, but I know in the end, I'm going to be a better person and growth is going to happen. So it's really an individual thing. You know, we all want world peace. We all want racism to end, and it's not going to happen unless we start within ourselves. And it's not going to happen unless you push yourself into very uncomfortable situations. I guarantee you that.
I love it. So it starts with us. And yes, beautiful. Well said. All right. So Willie Wani, I personally and everybody from our steering committee, we want to thank you for joining us today, sharing her story and helping us to pave the way for our next generations, as we heard this throughout our talk. I also do want to share next is our Shiro recognition session, and you will not want to miss this. And I'm not sure if someone can drop in the chat box the link so that you can just click on it and help us celebrate our true Shiros. I don't want to spoil who they are, but they are 4 amazing women that are so deserving of this recognition of being a Shiro. But in my opinion, we've already started the Shiro panel, and it starts with us right here. So just thank you for everything that you do, and keep thriving and being resilient. But I look forward to seeing everybody over to session 2, and happy National Women's Heritage Month. Willie Wani, thank you.
Aloha.
Aloha.